It was the summer of 1997. One of the most recognizable companies in American history was 12 weeks away from complete bankruptcy. Their stock had fallen 97% in just 10 years. Best Buy had stopped selling their products. Microsoft, their biggest rival, was worth 50 times more than them. Employees were quietly updating their resumes. Journalists had already written the obituaries. And the man who would save Apple had been thrown out of his own company 12 years earlier. This is the story of the night Apple almost disappeared forever and the single phone call that changed everything. To understand how bad things were in 1997, we need to go back to where it all began. A garage in Cupertino, California. Two college dropouts, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, built a computer on a wooden board. It looked nothing like what computers looked like back then. It was personal, simple, human. By 1980, Apple had become one of the fastest-growing companies in American history. Their IPO made Steve Jobs worth $200 million at just 25 years old. But success brought problems. Apple hired a new CEO, John Sculley, a man who had previously run Pepsi. And in 1985, the Apple board made a decision that would haunt them for over a decade. They fired Steve Jobs. The man who started Apple was no longer allowed inside Apple. Jobs was devastated, humiliated, angry. He left and started a new company called Next. And Apple, without its founder, without its soul, Apple began to slowly die. The 1990s were a disaster for Apple. One CEO replaced another, then another, then another. In just 7 years, Apple had 4 different CEOs. Every single one failed to stop the bleeding. While Apple was busy making dozens of confusing products that nobody wanted, a young man named Bill Gates was quietly taking over the world. Windows 95 launched in 1995, and it was a phenomenon. People lined up outside stores at midnight just to buy it. Microsoft was winning. Badly. Apple's market share collapsed from 16% to barely 4%. Then came the moment that broke everything. In 1996, Apple's new CEO, Gil Amelio, stood in front of investors and said something nobody expected. He admitted, Apple is in deep trouble. The stock crashed the very next day. Major retailers started pulling Apple products from their shelves. Best Buy, one of Apple's biggest partners, stopped carrying Apple computers entirely. Suppliers stopped trusting them. Banks started getting nervous. Inside Apple's offices in Cupertino, the mood was like a funeral. Employees who had dedicated years of their lives to this company were watching it collapse in real time. Engineers who believed in Apple's mission were quietly calling recruiters, quietly updating their LinkedIn profiles, quietly looking for exits. And then, the numbers came out. Apple had lost $1.6 billion in just 18 months. Their cash reserves, the money needed to pay employees, suppliers, rent, everything, were down to their last 90 days. Not 90 months, not 90 weeks, 90 days. After 90 days, Apple could not pay its bills. After 90 days, 10,000 people would lose their jobs. After 90 days, one of the most iconic companies ever created would simply cease to exist. The board panicked. They fired CEO Gil Amelio. And now, Apple had no CEO, no money, no products people wanted, and 90 days to survive. But 6 months earlier, something had happened that nobody fully understood yet. Apple had purchased Steve Jobs' company, Next, for $429 million. At the time, people thought it was just a technology purchase. Nobody realized they had just bought back their founder. Jobs returned to Apple as an advisor, and what he saw inside shocked him. Too many products, too much confusion, zero focus. Apple was trying to make printers, cameras, PDAs, servers, speakers, everything at once, and doing none of it well. Jobs walked the hallways and felt sick. This was his company, his baby, his life's work, and it was dying because nobody had the courage to make hard decisions. Then came the phone call that changed history. Steve Jobs called Bill Gates, his biggest rival, the man whose company had spent years trying to destroy Apple. Jobs swallowed his pride and made the call. He asked Microsoft for help. And in August 1997, at Apple's developer conference, something happened that made the entire audience go silent. Bill Gates's face appeared on a giant screen behind Steve Jobs, live, via satellite. The audience didn't cheer, they booed. Because to Apple fans, Bill Gates was the enemy. But Jobs stood calmly and delivered the news. Microsoft was investing $150 million into Apple. The two companies were setting aside their war. Microsoft Office would continue on Mac. Apple would survive. The room went quiet. Some people clapped. Some people cried. And Steve Jobs, for just one moment, allowed himself to breathe.
Jobs was named permanent CEO shortly after. He immediately canceled 70% of Apple's products. 70%! Everything that wasn't essential, gone. He laid off thousands of people, renegotiated every contract, and focused Apple on doing a few things perfectly. In 1998, just 1 year later, Apple launched the iMac, a colorful, beautiful, simple computer that looked like nothing else on Earth. It sold 800,000 units in just 5 months. Apple was profitable again. Then came the iPod, the iTunes Store, the iPhone, the iPad. The company that had 90 days of cash left in 1997 became the first company in history worth $1 trillion, and eventually $3 trillion. So what is the lesson here? It's not just a business lesson, it's a human lesson. The moment Apple stopped trying to do everything was the moment it started winning at everything. The moment its founder swallowed his pride and made the hardest phone call of his life was the moment the company was saved. Apple didn't survive because of luck. Apple survived because one man refused to let it die. And sometimes that's all it takes. One person, one decision, one phone call. 90 days from death to $3 trillion. If that's not the most extraordinary comeback story in business history, I don't know what is.
If you want to see more stories like this, companies that stood at the very edge of collapse and somehow found their way back, subscribe. Because next week, we're telling the story of a company whose founder gambled the last company money in Las Vegas just to make payroll. That story is even more insane than this one. I'll see you there.